Does Europe truly need immigration to function, or is that a misconception? Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, elected on an anti-immigration platform, recently granted 400,000 worker permits to tackle labor shortages. Yet across the continent, following an election defeat, Frans Timmermans, leader of the left-wing PVD, a GroenLinks alliance in the Netherlands, warned that uncontrolled immigration could dismantle the Dutch welfare state. These starkly contrasting viewpoints make it incredibly difficult to grasp the true picture and determine if immigration genuinely benefits Europe's economy. Adding another layer of complexity, much of the English-language debate on immigration centers on the United States, a nation that attracts different immigrant profiles and operates with vastly distinct labor and welfare systems compared to European countries. This divergence is precisely why I've dedicated the past few weeks to meticulously examining the most recent studies on this topic, specifically focusing on European nations. My goal is to navigate the highly politicized landscape of immigration and its economic impact, not just to face inevitable criticism in the comments, but to definitively answer whether immigration is truly beneficial for European economies, for European workers, and what it signifies for the long-term viability of European welfare states. We'll also explore what might happen if Europe were to adopt a Japanese-style approach, severely limiting immigration. Prepare to uncover some surprising truths about the economics of immigration in Europe. Welcome to Strategic Horizon, where we explore the complex forces shaping our world. Europe is currently a major destination for immigrants, with many politicians advocating for even greater numbers. While historical factors like guilt over colonialism and its role in impoverishing and destabilizing regions across the world certainly play a part, Europe's demand for migrants, both historically and today, is primarily justified by the necessity to address three significant economic challenges. Europe, like much of the global community, is aging rapidly, and this demographic shift presents profound economic problems for its nations. The first challenge is Europe's demographic labor shortage. With fewer people of working age, it's increasingly difficult to find individuals for critical sectors such as construction and agriculture, as well as skilled technicians who form the backbone of the economy. A consistent supply of labor is crucial to keeping labor prices competitive and ensuring European industries remain viable. This labor is essential for maintaining prosperity. Fewer people mean a reduction in both the production and consumption of goods and services, which would inevitably diminish Europe's overall prosperity. In essence, a decreasing population could lead to a form of degrowth, with businesses closing due to a shrinking consumer base. This shrinking prosperity could also complicate Europe's third major challenge, maintaining its robust welfare states. As more people retire, the ratio of non-workers to workers in European countries has steadily climbed over the past 2 decades, placing immense pressure on public finances. A larger elderly population translates to increased spending on pensions and healthcare, which must be funded by a shrinking pool of active laborers, a topic I've explored in a previous video. It's for these reasons that many European countries have turned to immigration over the last 2 decades to address, or at least mitigate, some of these pressing issues. They have opened their doors to substantial numbers of immigrants through various channels, including regular pathways like the Schengen area, the issuance of additional work permits, family reunification policies, and by welcoming refugees. Additionally, migrants arrive through irregular channels, often crossing the Mediterranean. But can these immigrants genuinely help tackle Europe's 3 economic challenges? To answer this, we must first differentiate between various types of immigration. Many studies, books, and news articles on immigration fall short because they fail to categorize immigrants effectively. This oversight often stems from a lack of distinguishing data or, arguably, an intention to obscure the real impact of different immigrant groups. From my research, There are primarily four ways to classify immigrants, which I will use interchangeably when discussing their economic impact. The first classification distinguishes between high-skilled and low-skilled immigrants, often including a separate subcategory for refugees when analyzing economic impact and employment rates. The second distinction is between EU and non-EU migration. This is largely due to how Eurostat, the European Union's Statistics Bureau, categorizes EU immigrants separately in most demographic and economic data. This distinction is also useful because EU versus non-EU migration often aligns closely, though not perfectly, with the high-skilled versus low-skilled divide. The third classification, almost exclusive to Denmark, categorizes immigrants based on their country of origin. Finally, another data type focuses on the specific permits individuals receive, whether for work, study, family reunification, or as refugees. This allows for comparing the effectiveness of different entry points for immigrants and their subsequent impact on the labor market. Now, armed with these distinctions, let's return to the first of our three economic problems. Do immigrants prevent labor shortages in critical jobs? And do immigrants actually work? According to official data, a majority of immigrants do find employment, but there are significant disparities between groups. Eurostat statistics show that EU immigrants often have higher employment rates than natives, while non-EU immigrants generally have considerably lower rates. A separate study indicates that refugees are less likely to work compared to other immigrants. In Germany, employment for refugees is virtually zero during their first year, as they are not permitted to work while their paperwork is processed. In Finland, only 22% of refugees are employed after a decade. The International Labor Organization corroborates this, reporting that it takes approximately 20 years for refugees in Sweden to achieve similar employment rates to family reunification immigrants. Restrictive rules for seeking employment, language barriers, and workplace discrimination all contribute to slowing immigrants' entry into the workforce. For refugees, bureaucratic hurdles preventing initial employment, coupled with the generosity of European welfare states, also play a role. Denmark observed that male refugees found employment faster once their benefits were reduced. This contrasts sharply with the United States, where less welfare creates a stronger incentive to work, and refugees typically catch up to the high employment rates of other immigrants within a decade, reaching nearly 80% employment. This might explain why countries like France, Italy, Germany, and Denmark have moved to reduce public benefits for refugees and immigrants in general, aiming to encourage their participation in the workforce. With most immigrants eventually working, the next question is, what jobs do they fill? All studies agree that Europe faces a labor shortage, particularly in lower-skilled professions. EU data indicates that immigrants do indeed take low-skilled jobs with labor shortages, but again, there are substantial disparities. Migrants are overrepresented in roles like construction workers, bartenders, and waiters in countries without labor shortages. Simultaneously, more migrants were recruited to fill positions such as machinery mechanics and repairers, structural metal workers, drivers, and personal care workers in countries that did experience shortages. Looking at individual country data, in France, immigrants were most likely to work in household help for care and cleaning, as security agents, waiters, cooks, or in municipal maintenance. In Germany, they were employed in cleaning, food production, transportation, construction, and tourism. This presents a challenge, as Europe's labor shortages are often more about specific skills and talent than the sheer number of available workers. So, does this mean immigration isn't effectively addressing Europe's second problem, shrinking GDP and decreasing prosperity? Growing a country's population is one of the quickest ways to boost its GDP. In 2023, 64% of job growth and half of Spain's economic growth could be attributed to immigration. For highly skilled workers, the benefits are clear. They drive productivity growth across the economy. However, the picture isn't entirely negative for low-skilled workers. According to a World Bank study, low-skilled workers can still impact productivity by enabling skilled workers, primarily natives, to specialize further. For instance, if my parents were ill, my siblings and I would typically care for them. But with a healthcare worker, many of whom are lower-skilled immigrants, I might be able to dedicate more time to highly productive activities like creating YouTube videos. This effect, however, is difficult to quantify directly, and I haven't found studies explicitly attempting to measure it. Another way immigrants increase prosperity is through consumption of goods and services. Imagine I'm a baker selling 4 baguettes a day. If more people move into town and I can now sell 6, I become more productive and might even hire help to expand my business. An increased population simply enables more businesses to thrive and enhances the quality of services. However, this rise in consumption can also create problems, particularly concerning housing, where there are currently severe supply limitations, a topic I've discussed previously. While immigrants do contribute to economic growth in terms of GDP, we must also consider their impact on public finances. In other words, whether immigrants help sustain welfare states. A relatively new type of graph analyzes net fiscal balance, which essentially measures how much tax an individual pays versus the social benefits they receive over their lifetime. Generally, people consume significant welfare through childcare and education early in life, contribute more than they receive as working adults, and then become beneficiaries again in retirement, receiving health care and pensions. High-skilled individuals tend to be more productive, pay more taxes, and claim fewer benefits, making them a net fiscal gain for the welfare state. Conversely, lower-skilled individuals earn less, produce less, and contribute significantly less. 5 economists associated with the Joint Research Council of the European Union investigated this for different immigrant groups. Their findings showed that non-EU immigrants contributed less in taxes, which is unsurprising given that most are lower skilled. Meanwhile, EU migrants, who tend to be highly educated, contributed much more than natives. The Danish government takes this a step further, classifying immigrants and their descendants by their region of origin. Middle Eastern migrants, for example, showed negative fiscal contributions throughout their lives. This was attributed to a younger retirement age, low workforce participation, especially among women, and their predominant presence in the low-skilled labor pool. So, what is immigration's actual impact on public finances? High-skilled workers and EU immigrants can make substantial tax contributions, which explains why European countries actively compete to attract young, highly skilled workers and talent from around the world. For low-skilled immigrants, the picture is less clear. On the surface, much of the benefit comes from a demographic dividend, adding workers without the cost of raising or educating them. Refugees, upon arrival, incur additional welfare state costs in the form of housing, handouts, and education, some of which can be long-term if they are not integrated into the workforce. However, there are notable differences between countries regarding the impact of these immigrants on government balances. A study analyzing total taxes versus benefits received between 2007 and 2018 found that in Germany, France, and Sweden, non-EU immigrants were a net drain and performed worse than natives. In Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece, and Ireland, immigrants, including non-EU immigrants, paid more taxes and utilized fewer benefits than natives. This disparity can likely be linked to the age structure of immigrants in these countries, who tend to be more recent arrivals and younger, thus more likely to be working. However, this isn't the complete picture. There might be additional, often unaccounted for benefits known as indirect fiscal benefits of immigration. If immigrants increase the output of other workers, particularly the highly skilled, then some of that higher output could be indirectly attributed to the immigrants themselves. For example, if the healthcare system for my parents allows me to produce 3 videos a month instead of 2, then perhaps some of my productivity and the taxes I pay are indirectly due to their healthcare provider's assistance. This effect is challenging to measure directly within an economy, But according to Mark Colas and Dominique Sachs' modeling of these effects in the US, it's estimated to contribute approximately $750 in taxes per immigrant. While not enough to entirely close the gap between welfare costs and taxes, it's still a significant amount. I couldn't find a comparable study for Europe, but based on the parameters used for calculation, which include the size of social benefits, worker participation, and income, I would estimate this effect to be somewhat smaller in European countries compared to the US. While low-skilled immigrants offer short-term economic dividends due to their age, if they settle permanently, as Europe's immigration systems often allow, the costs they impose on Europe's welfare system will increase as they age and retire, and also when they have children. According to the Joint Research Council study, across nearly all EU welfare systems, the cost of non-EU children is significantly greater than that of native or EU children. Immigrant families tend to be larger and often rely on European welfare states to alleviate poverty and improve educational outcomes for lower-income groups. The only reason this isn't the case in the so-called Mediterranean corporatist model seems to be that Spain and Italy have some of the most stringent family support policies for new parents, resulting in minimal differences between immigrants and natives in this regard. While these children could eventually help address labor shortages, PISA scores, an international standardized test, reveal that the human capital of immigrant-descended children in European countries is considerably lower than that of native children. Despite some gains for second-generation immigrants, their scores remain much lower than natives. This can often be explained by the lower educational background of their parents, but it also demonstrates that catching up for some communities, if at all possible, is at the very least a multi-generational endeavor and heavily depends on how well immigrants' descendants are integrated. While EU-descended immigrants often outperform natives in the labor market, securing better jobs and higher employment rates, it's fair to say that in many European countries, the integration of certain non-EU communities has lagged. Eurostat data indicates that the average employment of all immigrants across the EU was nearly 7% lower for second-generation migrants than for natives, and even lower than the first generation, though there are significant disparities between countries. In Belgium, Ireland, and Spain, second-generation immigrants perform considerably worse than their parents. Conversely, in Germany and the Netherlands, second-generation immigrants have caught up somewhat with natives. While this might suggest that many immigrants and their descendants are involved in the informal economy, it also means these descendants are less likely to pay taxes. Coupled with the high cost of raising children and lower participation of second-generation immigrants in the workforce, low-skilled immigration is likely a drain on the welfare state in the long run. However, focusing solely on these aspects might cause us to overlook other crucial dimensions of immigration, particularly its effects on native populations. When we consider the complete picture, as Anthony Ito and Saeed Ould Ahmed did for European countries, immigration has generally had a negative impact on low-skilled natives, who experienced short-term decreases in employment that eventually stabilized into a long-term equilibrium. Skilled workers, meanwhile, saw gains in the long run. The situation becomes even more complex when we apply the categories discussed earlier. As a native, you tend to benefit more from immigrants who are different from you. Low-skilled laborers, especially those who are immigrants themselves, are most affected by the arrival of new immigrants who compete for the same jobs. This might explain why, in an unexpected plot twist, Germany's anti-immigration AfD party has been targeting ethnic minority votes. These groups are often most at risk from newer immigrants taking their jobs and are the most impacted in terms of their salaries. This suggests that, overall, low-skilled migration is detrimental to low-skilled workers, as it increases their unemployment and decreases their wages, while simultaneously expanding opportunities for skilled workers. Beyond economics, there are also broader societal aspects of immigration that impact the economy. If increased immigration leads to declining social trust and cohesion, That represents an economic cost that is difficult to incorporate into our previous calculations. Compounding this is the link between immigration, particularly poorly integrated immigration, and crime. This could be the subject of an entirely new video, but it's a concern taken seriously by investors in France who fear a lack of safety in the country, as well as by the head of Sweden's central bank, who is worried about the economic effects of gang violence. So, do the pros of immigration outweigh the cons? It largely depends on the type of immigration. Regarding labor shortages, high-skilled immigration has a limited impact since most shortages are for less qualified positions. Low-skilled workers help, but their employment in truly critical sectors is often limited. Refugees, due to their typically lower skill and employment levels, have limited positive impact for most countries. For prosperity and GDP growth, both high-skilled and low-skilled immigrants contribute through their work and consumption, while refugees primarily contribute as consumers. Finally, concerning the welfare state, high-skilled immigration is a net positive. Low-skilled immigration is beneficial in the short term, but becomes costly in the long term, whereas refugees are generally a net drain. But is there a way to alter this balance and improve Europe's migration policy? Europe's primary focus should be on being more selective about who it allows into its countries. Long-term economic costs suggest that limiting low-skilled immigration should be a priority. Europe's current migration policy, significantly driven by refugees and family reunification, whereby immigrants are allowed to bring their families, is not an optimal strategy for solving its three main economic challenges. Such policies often result in a predominantly low-skilled population with low labor force participation, increasing the burden on the welfare state without adequately addressing labor shortages in the sectors Europe truly needs. One potential solution is to implement a guest worker model, similar to those in place during the 1960s and 70s, where workers were not allowed to bring their families and were expected to return home after their contracts ended. This model is currently employed in Poland and much of the rest of the world. The challenge today is that labor migration is frequently tied to family reunification, and with family reunification being a policy for the past 2 decades, it will be incredibly difficult to reverse course and return to a guest worker model. Another approach to making immigration more beneficial is to direct immigrants to where their labor is most needed. Denmark, for instance, has successfully increased the labor participation rate of its foreign-born population by encouraging immigrants into the workforce. In 2021, it announced that social benefits for migrant women would be contingent on 37 hours of weekly work, while also providing them with educational opportunities. Similarly, Germany's latest immigration law allows migrants to enter the country to pursue vocational education before offering them employment opportunities. However, there are significant trade-offs between solutions aimed at Europe's different goals. Short-term financing of the welfare state through mass low-skilled immigration conflicts with long-term sustainability. Finding a sufficient number of workers is easier if family reunification visas are permitted, but this again impacts welfare states. Alternatively, there's another option. If we conclude that migration is simply not economically worthwhile, or that its impact on the social fabric is too high, Europe could choose the Japan route and severely restrict it. Japan is by far the world's oldest country, and unlike many Western societies, it has received extremely limited immigration, with foreign-born residents making up less than 2% of its population. Consequently, Japan's efforts to curb the decline of its workforce have focused primarily on increasing labor force participation among women and the elderly. While somewhat successful in boosting the overall number of workers, the Japanese labor force is still shrinking alongside its population. This has led to decreased tax revenue, a decline in the service industry, and falling consumption and savings as more money is redirected to care for the elderly. For companies, there has been a loss of knowledge as the younger generation is too small to absorb the expertise of previous generations, resulting in more workplace accidents. Businesses are going bankrupt due to an inability to find workers, with corporate bankruptcies increasing by 444% between 2013 and 2019. Combined with a culture of long working hours, chronic labor shortages have left Japan's working population severely overworked, with one study indicating that 22% of Japanese companies have employees working at levels that expose them to a serious risk of death. Because its elderly population cannot fill agricultural or construction jobs, some of the country's oldest professions, with the average Japanese farmer being almost 69 years old, Japan is now forced to turn to some level of immigration for seasonal work. This isn't the only change. The country has been overhauling its migration policy since 2018 to open its doors to lower-skilled immigration, though most of it remains temporary and limited to countries deemed culturally similar, like Vietnam. Yet even with these changes, restrictive immigration policies that limit family reunification and permanent residency mean Japan struggles to meet its quotas for key, albeit lower-skilled jobs like technicians. To make matters worse, since most immigration is temporary, employers are often reluctant to invest in training for staff, leading to lower productivity among immigrant workers. Thus, Japan's near-zero immigration pathway is hardly the utopian society it's sometimes portrayed to be. So where does this leave us, and how much immigration does your country truly need? As this is an optimization problem, there's no single clear-cut answer. It depends on welfare and integration policies, population aging trends, retirement ages, and cultural identity factors, all of which evolve with political preferences over time. It also depends on the kind of society Europe desires. Does it want older, less populated, and less dynamic countries with greater social cohesion? Or younger, more dynamic economies at the cost of some of that social cohesion? This is the fundamental question that Europe's migration policy, or indeed its lack thereof, is currently answering for us. Since most immigration to Europe occurs through regular channels, Europeans actually have a direct say in the demographic and economic future of their continent through their votes. What do you think? How much immigration does Europe truly need, or should it accept? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. After this video, I have many more questions related to integration, cultural compatibility, and the future of competition for immigration between countries seeking to bolster their labor forces, which I hope to address in future discussions.